I'm the last survivor of the Holocaust in our family.
Behind the words, pictures, and artifacts in the museum are people whose stories of survival and hope come alive to inspire new generations of upstanders. One by one, these stories stir the soul.
Can there really be hope for us?
Mine is 4018. My sister was 4017.
Holocaust survivors, their descendants, liberators, champions of justice, and courageous upstanders ask only this: hear my story, so that the lessons they teach will echo for generations.
I will never meet someone else like my father. But there are many of us who, if we come together, can keep his voice alive.
These stories will change you. They will move you to action, inspiring the best of humanity every day. I'm Jackie Congedo. In this episode, you'll hear from Elisha Wiesel, chairman of the Elie Wiesel Foundation and the only son of Elie Wiesel. Elie was a Holocaust survivor, Nobel Peace Prize winner, and author of Night, the widely acclaimed account of his experiences in Nazi concentration camps. Elie became the world's foremost voice on the necessity of fighting indifference and remembering each other's humanity. I spoke with Elisha about his childhood, both of his extraordinary parents, his faith, his work as an upstander, and the new fight against the world's oldest hatred, antisemitism. Welcome to the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust and Humanities Center.
Thank you, Jackie.
Historic Union Terminal. It is such a pleasure to have you in Cincinnati in this particular moment. And in particular, to be able to be in conversation with you as part of one of our first interviews in our new expanded Center for Storytelling, our Cynthia and Harold Gutman Family Center for Storytelling, which is going to feature a new podcast and all kinds of new exciting things. Just to paint the picture for the folks who might be listening instead of watching us talk right now, we're here inside our Holocaust gallery, inside the museum. And, this space is special, as I was sharing with you, Elisha, because this is actually physically in this building, the space where local survivors came to rebuild their lives and took their first steps. And it feels to me so poignant in this moment and special to have you here, a child, obviously, of survivors, and not just any survivor, but, the only child of Nobel laureate, activist, professor, and, prolific writer, Elie Wiesel. And of course, you yourself, in addition to being so proximate to him and his lessons, are an upstander in your own right. And the work that you continue to do to carry that legacy forward is something I'm excited to talk with you about today. So I do want to talk and save some time for sort of the present conversation about rising antisemitism and, specifically, what we've been witnessing relatively recently. But before we get into that, I just want to start with sort of at the beginning. And, we all know that your father had this amazing life and career and now legacy. But really, at the very beginning, for you, he just was dad, right? Tell me a little bit about, what that means for you and sort of how that shaped your identity growing up to be his son.
First of all, Jackie, thank you so much for having me here. And what an unbelievable space and what an unbelievable group of people. I'm really excited to get to connect with your community today. Growing up with my father was, in one way, a challenging process. Mm-hmm. Both of my parents were European immigrants, war refugees, and I wanted nothing more at my modern Orthodox yeshiva than to be an American kid. Mm. I wanted to play baseball. I wanted to collect baseball cards. I wanted to have the normal American life.
Sure.
My parents spoke French to each other in the house. I wanted nothing to do with that. And while my friends were going to Palm Beach or the Hamptons for their summer or winter breaks, I was getting jettisoned around the world to Auschwitz, Poland. So I knew something was different about my family growing up. But I think the remarkable thing about the way my father handled all that and how he was as a father is, in the first instance, he actually tried to protect me from as much of it as he could. He didn't want it to define me. It was very important for him that I not feel growing up that I had this burden on my shoulders. And he knew there was a burden, but he wanted to defer it as long as he could, which is pretty remarkable given how central all of this was to his life. The second thing was the degree to which my father was willing to stretch for this American kid who wanted to be American. When my father got a call to throw out the first pitch at the World Series Game 3 in 1986, of course, at first he said no, but I was like, no, Dad, you have to. And I taught him how to throw a pitch. And let's not talk about whether or not it, got all the way to home plate. But like the fact that he did it for me, he was quite willing to stretch into the new modern era for his younger, more modern son.
Wow. And I'm thinking, and as I was reading in sort of preparation for this, about your own journey from sort of that American kid who was just trying to kind of live any other sort of, American childhood life in New York City, to where you are now in really understanding what this means for your identity and for your legacy and your own sort of journey to embrace your family's history. It was bumpy, right? I mean, tell me a little bit about that for you and really, I also would like to know just sort of when your father first told you about his history. And is that something you remember in sort of pieces of conversations throughout some of your earlier memories, or was there a moment where, you first really understood? Take me back to that.
Yeah, my father had a writing desk in his office where above it hung a picture of his home in Sighet, a picture that he had taken in the 1950s. Very gray, dark, bleak-looking photo. And his typewriter was right underneath it. That was his writing station. And I used to pop up at age 4 or 5 or 6 and just pop into his lap. And I'd want to like hunt and peck myself and help my father work, as so many kids enjoy doing with their fathers. And I remember saying, is that where you grew up? Yes. Why don't I have grandparents from your side? And he would sort of pause. Did something happen to them? And he'd say, yes, something bad happened, but he didn't want to elaborate. He was protecting me. That's my first earliest conversation that I can remember. But
and you were how old at this?
5, 6,
Wow.
Old enough to still be popping into his lap.
Right.
So must have been around there. You asked if the path was bumpy. I mean, I'd say the stewardesses were strapped into their seats, not serving drinks. The things were bumping around in the cabin.
Quite bumpy.
It was quite bumpy. Look, I wanted normalcy so bad.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted nothing to do with intellectuals coming in and out of our salon, on a weekend. I wanted nothing to do, frankly, with Judaism. I'd gone to a 14-year program at a modern Orthodox school. And by the time I was done, I just didn't want to hear about God. I didn't want to say any more prayers. I didn't want to read any more Talmud. I wanted like anything else. I was like, how about Buddhism? And so I'd say and I don't want to say that I was necessarily the most respectful child as I went through this bumpiness with my parents. I gave them a fair amount of grief, I would say. So yes, the path was extremely bumpy.
And sort of through that path, you had certain milestones from what I've, listened and read about your relationship with your dad and some of the experiences you had. You went back with him to Romania.
I did.
To see sort of for yourself some of those early chapters in his life. Can you tell me a little bit what that was like to be there with him?
Yeah, I can. But I would just say one thing on the bumpiness question, which is, the resolution to my relationship with my father didn't start magically on that one trip to Romania. It really had to do with the way my father dealt with me and the patience that he showed. And there are Hasidic stories that I can tell you that inform how and why he did that. But he was an incredible father because he gave me the space. He recognized what a burden it was to be the son of such a prominent Holocaust survivor. And he realized what a burden it is to be a Jew.
Yeah,
that it can be a burden in this day and age. And he was so respectful and so patient with me that the groundwork for an eventual return, I think, was laid very early. We went in spring of 1995, or maybe even summer, to Sighet, Romania. We did a trip to Sighet, and then we went to Auschwitz. And it was me, my father, and my cousin, Steve, who really is a brother to me. It's my father's sister's son. And it was a turning point for me. I had just finished doing a military training program in Israel. I was just before I was returning to the workforce properly. And the trip to Sighet, for me, was the first time that I started to see the world the way my father saw it. Walking around this town that used to have a thriving Jewish population and observing my father responding to Jews who were no longer there.
Wow.
It was almost as though he had a radio that was picking up signals that the rest of us could not pick up, but the signals were there. These people had lived their lives. You could imagine him running around a street corner, picking up the challahs, through the windowsill at his grandmother's as she asks him questions about the weekly Torah portion, racing off to Cheder where he was learning, making sure he got home in time for Shabbat. You could feel the brush of air as that younger man, who was my father, was sort of running past us. It was the first time that I think I saw my father as vulnerable. He was always so strong. And to see him really start to break down in that place had a very powerful effect on me. It really opened up something within me.
Wow. Wow. And then from that experience to Auschwitz itself and being with him side by side to sort of experience that, I can't even imagine the power of that moment.
Listen, Auschwitz was terrifying and sober and somber. But if I had to tell you between the two experiences, Sighet was by far the more powerful, because Sighet is where the Jews lived.
Yeah.
They'd spent a century or more there. They'd taken root. You felt their presence in the spot where, like, you could see the faded place where a mezuzah had been, or the synagogue that had been repurposed or was now full of abandoned scrolls. The Jews went through Auschwitz on their way to their death, but it wasn't a place where they made their mark. Sighet was a place where our people lived, and you felt the immensity of the tragedy in being there.
Yeah, and the loss of that life, the loss of that experience of living, and the vibrancy of that.
They died in Auschwitz, but they lived in Sighet. They lived in all of these towns across Eastern Europe. They put down roots. They bartered with their non-Jewish neighbors. They built shuls. They built schools. Some of them were more secular. Some of them were more observant. They wanted to become doctors. They had this they had life.
Yeah.
They had what we have. They had life. And to go there and feel its absence was very profound.
I think that's so important. And we talk about that a lot in the work we do here at the center around the need to start with humanizing. In fact, for those, again, who are listening, behind you is the part of our museum that really opens the experience for visitors. And the first thing people see when they come into the museum is life. It was critically important for the folks who designed this space that we start with the humanizing and shrinking the distance between us and them, so that we really can confront the humanity that was lost in this horrific tragedy. And I just think it's so powerful hearing you reflect on that as well. I want to ask you, because I'm sure most of the questions you get are about your dad, but I was reading a little bit about your mother, who was also a survivor, or is a survivor. She's still
of course.
Still living.
Yeah.
And tell us a little bit about, the dynamic between the two of them. I know she was really in her time a civil rights activist.
Yeah. I'd love to tell you about my mom. First of all, she was my father's partner in everything. My father was a man who had big ideas. He had deep and profound ideas, but he needed someone in his life who could get things done. And that was my mom.
Yeah,
the
right.
perfect marriage of the cerebral and the practical.
Wow.
And my mother also was a survivor and a war refugee. And in the same way that I did this trip to Sighet, Romania, we took her and my wife and her grandkids to Vienna to do a retracing of her steps throughout the war.
Oh,
we did this in 2018. And we started in Vienna. We actually got access to the room that she lived in. These people who lived there were nice enough to let us upstairs. And we got to see the view from her window, where she had placed a doll that looked out at her as she went into exile. She had waved goodbye to that doll in that very window seat.
How old was she?
She was 8.
Wow.
Yeah.
She remembers that.
She remembers it vividly.
Yeah.
We went to the street corner where she and her father, my grandfather, watched the Anschluss, watched the Nazis parade in, and knew that the world would never be the same. We uncovered stories from her that I had never heard before about what it was like in school and what her non-Jewish classmates were doing to her and her Jewish classmates. And from Vienna, we followed her path. We went to Gurs, an internment camp in southwestern France in the Pyrenees. And we got to see where she was kept for, 8 or 9 months pending a transfer to Auschwitz, where her sister was able to bribe guards and they escaped and rescued her father, who was at a Saint-Cyprien, another camp nearby. We didn't get to go to Marseille, which is a fascinating place. It's where she actually was in hiding, and an Italian couple protected her. Oh, wow. But we did then go to Basel, which is where she was smuggled into because they had family. So she had her own amazing trip. And you mentioned my mother as a civil rights activist. My mother, you have to understand, everything she heard about the United States of America had it on such a pedestal, the bastion of freedom and democracy. And when she finally arrived in the early 1950s and saw African Americans being treated the way they were, being told to get out of that seat in the bus because a white person should sit there, her heart was broken and she became angry. And she did become an early NAACP member. And she used to do these tours down to Florida where she and a black gentleman would go in and they would have called to make a hotel reservation as Mr. and Mrs. Smith. And they would show up. They would be seen to be black and Jewish, and they would be denied service. And they took records of these things and started to build up the body of evidence of how they were being turned away. So my mother was deeply passionate about it. And it ended up translating into her later work, but I don't want to get ahead of ourselves.
Wow. I also just am sort of marveling at the miracle of your existence, right? 2 parents who survived the unthinkable, and just the odds of you being here is really something that's striking in and of itself.
Well, it's more than a probabilistic thing. You have to remember, my father had made a vow after the war to never have children. He felt that the world did not deserve more Jewish children.
Wow.
And there were a number of people who had to convince him to shift from that position, including the Lubavitcher Rebbe, including his teacher, Saul Lieberman, and of course, most of all, including my mother, that he had to be moved from that position. His starting position after the war was, it didn't make sense.
And what was it that moved him to change his mind about that?
Look, I think ultimately, this is where my mom gets a tremendous amount of credit. She obviously gets credit for my existing, wouldn't be here without her. But I think that became a conversation. My mother wanted another child. I have a half sister from my mother's previous marriage. And I think my father had, by way of a little bit of a digression, my father had a beloved teacher named Shoshani while he was in the south of France in the orphanage after the war. And he was a big follower of Shoshani. And I hadn't put some pieces together until at my father's Shiva, a gentleman came in who was basically like a Satmar-looking chassid, the black hat, the kaftan, the full dress, speaking Yiddish. And it turned out that he was the son of Menashe Klein, who had been a deep friend of my father's in the camps. And he told me a story that finally put a number of things together. He said, that man Shoshani who taught your father, did you know that he was in Cherem? Did you know that he'd been excommunicated from many in the Jewish community? I said, no. And he said, and do you know the reason why he was excommunicated? He was excommunicated because he was teaching a heresy that the Jews should stop having children. And I put 2 and 2 together and I realized that there must have been a teaching that my father had been engaged with or received. Maybe it wasn't something he came to completely independently.
Wow.
Anyway, end digression.
Wow. That is a fascinating and sort of dark idea, but his evolution on that is sort of so meaningful in and of itself.
And when his grandson was born, he said to me, I didn't know that I had room in my heart, but somehow I made it.
Wow.
Yeah.
I want to go back to a specific point as I was listening to some of the interviews that you've done and talking about this bumpy airplane ride. Yeah. And the role, you mentioned something that was really special and stuck out to me because of the work that we do, particularly with educators. That, as you were sort of struggling with, being the person you were, and I think as you'd said, not the person that people wanted you to be, there were some educators who saw you for who you were and created space for that.
Yeah.
And I think about, the role of educators in today's environment, which is a terribly difficult thing. I mean, what are they not, right? They're security guards and teachers and mental health counselors and trauma experts. I mean, they really are so many different things. But I think about, beyond just the education, the fact that these people, these adults saw you and created space for you, and what that opened up for you, how that enabled you to kind of grow into this in your own time. Can you tell me a little bit, take me back to those moments when that happened? I just
Listen,
think
I had a Torah teacher who I'm still quite friendly with. She's a dear friend, Rachel Weinstein at Ramaz. And she was really this teacher who saw me, even though I was clearly grumpy all the time, clearly had a big chip on my shoulder. And she invited me for Shabbos to stay at her home with her. And I said, really? I'm not going to go to synagogue. She's like, you don't have to go to synagogue. I'm like, if I'm in my room, by myself, I might be, writing, I'm going to turn lights on and off. She's like, what you do? And I'm going to put you in the basement. You do what you do. And she invited me, and it was the first time I ever had cholent. It was the first time that I got to experience a true religious household with no pretensions at all, just the joy of family being together and the singing of songs. And, the Shabbos dinner table that I grew up with in my home, it was a very intellectual dinner table because my parents were intellectuals operating in a very high-powered environment. They would have, the person who ran the New York Times would be coming over, A.M. Rosenthal,
yes.
And the DA would be coming through, and they'd be having far and wide, big intellectual conversations. And this was a completely different experience for me, that family can just get together and eat and drink and argue and sing in this very liberated way. And years later, when I went to Israel and got to have Shabbat with my cousin Steve and see that, wow, here's someone my own age who's building a family and doing it this way, it just sort of changed my conception. So the thing that I learned and I want to pass on to our listeners is, when we think about the bumpy ride that I had, and ultimately, I think the thread that helped pull me out of it, it's discovering the joy in where we came from. It's discovering the unabashed joy in being Jewish, in celebrating and being part of this incredible tradition that has at its heart life and joy. And to me, I have turned the Shabbat dinner table into my bastion against the potential future assimilation of my children. That Shabbat dinner table is the thing that I think is going to get this next generation through. When I was at my, father's Shabbos table, if we only sang Shalom Aleichem, well, now we also sing Eshes Chayil. If we said the benching, the blessing for grace after meals quietly to ourselves, now we belt it out and we're all singing it, at my table. It's a place of joy that for me, I hope will be an anchor for my kids.
Anchor is it resonates deeply with me. I have two daughters, and I feel it's such a priority to cement a positive association with Jewish identity and to really allow them to live as much as possible in that space. So that's a beautiful sentiment. I have to ask you about the pivot from Wall Street executive and risk management and all of these very sort of, nuts and bolts business sort of adventures of yours to this role that you're sort of embracing now in this moment of activism and philanthropy. And, what has that been like for you? What's that? It feels like a one side of your brain, other side of your brain kind of thing.
I mean, can I make a correction on that?
Please, yes.
Can I try to shift a perception?
Yes.
Look, I was at Goldman for 25 years, and the idea that that's nuts and bolts, believe me, you're not going to sustain a creative, interested mind for 25 years if the work isn't creative and interesting, and if the people aren't exceptional people.
Yeah.
So I think, it's funny that you say that, because I turned down my job interview at Goldman when I was still a senior in college. I actually said, no, I don't want to go. They called me and I'm like, no, thank you. And my roommate was like, what are you doing? Because I had this perception that to work in the world of numbers and markets is this very cold, sterile environment. Yeah. It's not. It's not at all. And I could talk for a long time just about that. And I should also say I'm now, running a hedge fund with some friends. So I have not left that world.
Yeah.
But I will say that stepping out of a world where I had 10,000 people working for me at the end of 2019 to all of a sudden having time on my hands was an incredible gift. You can basically say I took a sabbatical for 2.5 years while I really just immersed in a number of other things. And to have the time to give a speech on an issue I'm passionate about, or to learn a page of Talmud a day, which really began, that cycle began the week after I left Goldman. Like the timing was amazing. The 7.5 year Daf Yomi cycle that hundreds of thousands of Jews are studying Talmud every single day, just restarted then. The ability to become an EMT or a ski patroller or to spend unbelievable time with my kids was worth it. I think there is something to the concept of the Jewish Shabbat, not just as a once a week thing, but also at like a higher scale, the idea that we need to take a break every so often and refresh ourselves. In terms of the pivot to I'll say public service or philanthropic work, to me, it really is, it's born out of feeling that there is a gap where my father was. Not that I can fill that gap. I will never be who he was. The experience that he had, and also the kind of person he was. That's a once in a generation thing. I will never meet someone else like my father. But there are many of us who, if we come together, can keep his voice alive between his students and those who are inspired by his words, and myself and others who haven't heard his words yet, but will experience something when they do. I think there's a lot of potential energy there, and I'm keen to unlock it.
Wow. I want to hit on Night, the obviously your father's memoir, and I'm thinking about that in the context of sort of this idea of the ripple effect that we talk about a lot here at the center, and the stories that demonstrate that it can feel overwhelming in this moment, right? And even in this history, it feels heavy and huge. But when we really boil it down, what made the difference and what makes the difference today is one person acting in one moment, right? And the ripple effect that sets off. And I think, it'd be hard to find a more powerful sort of example of that than this piece, Night, this memoir that your father wrote, which really is the seminal way that the world is introduced to, learns about this history.
That and Anne Frank.
So I want to ask you just first of all about your introduction to this story, to the text. When did you first read it, and sort of how was it introduced to you?
I think I probably first read it around age 12. My memory is not super crystal clear on that. But for me, I read it and it was clear to me from the beginning, I'm not just reading a book from a shelf. I'm reading my family's story.
Wow.
We're talking about my aunt, Tzipora, being murdered at the age of 9. And it's not that this is happening far away. This is my aunt. She should have been alive. I should have been able to meet her. She should have had kids. Very, very personal and direct. But I think that there's a level that it didn't penetrate me until I went to Sighet. I had to go there before the words could sort of really penetrate and unlock something.
You could see it come to life. What was in writing really became very real.
Well, because she was real in that moment to my father.
Yeah.
In Sighet, she was there.
Wow. In talking with, people today about Night and the effect that it's had, are there any sort of like stories that you would want to share about the ripple effect that reading this has had for others, teachers, students? I mean, I'm sure you get people all the time who come up to you and say, this left an impression on me. Anything in particular you would share that is particularly poignant? Or
listen, there are stories, people do come up and share how profound it was for them. But to me, I'm much more focused on the students reading it actually this very second, this very minute.
Wow, yeah.
The students in 8th, 9th, 10th grade, where they are reading Night this year, and we are obviously living through history at this very moment.
Yeah.
So all of these questions of why did American Jews stay silent to the extent that they did in the late 1930s and 1940s? Well, this is a window to see how people are behaving today in 2023. Are American Jews agitating? Are they getting involved? Are they doing every possible thing they can? Or are they suffering, or are they going on about their lives? I'm very focused on what the students who are reading Night this year of all years in particular are experiencing, and the questions that they are or are not asking their parents and teachers and colleagues.
Wow. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about this current moment. And I'll sort of say that generally because there's a lot to unpack. We're sitting sort of broadly in the midst of an era of rising anti-Semitism. And if you zoom out and look at sort of the scope of Jewish history all around the world and for thousands of years, it seems that we're unfortunately in this cycle of, an uptick in anti-Jewish rhetoric and violence against Jewish communities. This past October was the deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust, in Israel specifically. And I think that the Jewish community, it feels to me, and this is interesting, you bring it up in the context of students reading Night, is really trying to calibrate. What does this mean today? What is my role today? Where are the red lines? And I'm just, I'm trying to think about the sages who I've known in my life, my grandparents, and what they would say about what's happening right now and how they would help me calibrate. And I'm wondering if in quiet moments, your dad's voice creeps into your head and what does it say about what's happening right now?
This is going to sound a little flip, but there are very, very few benefits to no longer being on this earth. But I do think that one of them is the dead can't have words put in their mouths. I can't say what my father would say.
Yeah.
I don't want to be an AI, natural language processing model trying to do that. I can tell you as someone who is his son, who was extremely close to him, who has studied him deeply and, knew him, I think, on every level it's possible to know him. I can tell you how I feel, and you can choose to accept whether or not that is a reflection of who my father was, and what he would have thought here. This is kind of for all the marbles right now, is the way I see it.
What do you mean by that?
This is the moment where we have to decide how we're going to respond to anti-Semitism. Because Israel's future, I do truly believe, is at stake. Mm-hmm. I don't want to say Israel is so vulnerable that we can just blow on it and it's going to bend over. It's not. But it's hurting. It's hurting very, very badly. And if we are going to have, I think, any self-respect for ourselves as American Jews, we have to stand very, very firmly with Israel. And we have to change our own radar sense of what are we going to tolerate in polite company and what are we not going to tolerate in polite company. I am sure that in the 1930s, in civilized society, you would have people say, the Jews, they're disease-ridden and they steal. And there were some people who'd say, well, that's just them talking, and he doesn't really think that. Mm-hmm. It's just the polite thing to say.
Right.
And I feel that now there are lies being spread about our Jewish brothers and sisters in Israel, that if we don't call them out and oppose them, we are allowing otherwise well-meaning people to be mistaken and rationalize what we saw on October 7th. And there is no rationalizing what we saw on October 7th. What we saw on October 7th was absolute, brutal, gruesome, inhumane barbarism, the worst that is possible for one group of humans to do to another. And in my view, when we hear things like, well, Israel's guilty of apartheid. Whoa, slow down. I think American Jews have an obligation, not an opportunity, but an obligation to double click on that and say, actually, no. There's a pretty complex history here of Israel offering peace on multiple occasions. These are people who have hated us. They elected Hamas into office on the premise that they were more anti-Israel than the PA, not only less corrupt, but explicitly in the charter to destroy Israel. And now we're basically saying that we're going to start introducing moral equivalence and say that Israel is guilty because it doesn't let the people who want to destroy them move freely around their land. I hate to be quote unquote political because I know that there are many people who disagree on this issue. But if you want to know about my father, one must know that my father was not only a humanist, not only an activist for the Muslims in Bosnia, where he went to President Clinton at the opening of the Holocaust Museum and said, we must do something about what's going on in that country. My father was not just the gentle teacher and writer and witness. My father was a Zionist. It's become a bad word in certain circles, and that is a very, very sad day for American Jewry. Yeah. So I think we need to rediscover our backbone and rediscover our history on this issue.
Speaking of your father's Zionism,
I hope I didn't just cost you like a third of your, audience.
Listen,
here.
This is a space where we are opening for this kind of dialogue and discussion because I think it is important that we talk about it. I think it is important in this moment that we create the space to process this. Going back to your dad's love for Israel and and his support over the years, I was reading that when there was a conflict that would come up or an escalation that would happen, that it was sort of a habit. It was like
fly straight to Israel.
Yes.
Yep.
That he had to be there.
Yep. Had to be there.
Can you tell me about that? What did he say about that? And from what I was reading, he left you notes every time he would go. I'm just so curious in this moment to know what he said.
In theory, there's a tape recording that he made me during the Yom Kippur War where he's reporting on watching the tanks get ready to come into Tel Aviv. And I can't find that. I would love to find it. But I've been told that there is such a recording.
Maybe you will.
Maybe I will. One hopes. But I did find a letter that he wrote to me when the Scuds were falling in Gulf War I, and he'd flown to Israel, and he was in a bunker with his gas mask. And he, shared some of the thoughts, things he wanted me to know in case, God forbid, it was an undelivered letter because I found it sealed among his papers. It was a letter to be given to me only in case something had happened.
Wow.
Yeah.
What did it say?
I found it after his passing. And the letter basically said, remember these things. Remember that you're a Jew. Remember that you are who you are named after. My grandfather, Shlomo. It was a very powerful note of memory and grounding of who he was and what was important to him. And the fact that it was written in a bunker, so hastily, I think is very much a part of that. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, no, it's beautiful.
But I want to say one other thing.
Yeah.
My father didn't just run to Israel. I don't want to convey the impression that my father was just some Zionist who was only fixated on Israel's military might.
Yeah.
In 2006, he did something quite unusual. His friend Ariel Sharon had unilaterally withdrawn from Gaza to much criticism within Israel.
Yes.
It was something that they had discussed extensively. And in 2006, there was an opportunity to bring together Ehud Olmert and Mahmoud Abbas into the Petra Conference with King Abdullah of Jordan that my father sponsored through the Elie Wiesel Foundation. So I want to be very clear. My father felt that we needed to stand with Israel at all times, but when there were true opportunities for peace, there was nobody more eager than him to at least open the door and see where it would go. Even though he was highly skeptical, he still wanted to try. It was on the level of a belief in Mashiach almost, that one has to keep trying.
Wow. Let's pivot to the role of a Holocaust education in this moment. I think the whole field is sort of grappling with what the lane is for Holocaust education and museums. Certainly in addressing contemporary anti-Semitism, right? The danger of someone's only experience with anti-Semitism being this particular chapter in history and not understanding that this is a broader phenomenon that predates that and that still is with us today, unfortunately. Yep. And so I'm curious sort of what your take on that is. And also, as it relates to the specific conversation about what's happening in Israel, what has happened in Israel, what role does Holocaust education have to play in this moment?
Listen, Holocaust educators are arguably doing one of the most important jobs on the planet right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
My father wanted people to know, if you remember when President Carter had the idea that he wanted to commemorate the Holocaust, first of all, He did it because he was under pressure for some of his other Middle Eastern dealings, and he wanted to buy some respite from Jewish pressure at the time. But he wanted to create a monument. And my father said, absolutely not. If you're going to pull me in and use my name and establish a presidential commission, I am not going to budge until a federal museum is created.
Wow.
My father was the one who had the passion and the vision that the United States Holocaust Museum had to be created, and it was the only acceptable thing to be done. And they made it happen. So he was deeply, deeply committed to the thought that there was no substitute for there being spaces where students could come in with teachers, observe the primary sources, hear the testimonies, see the artifacts, immerse themselves for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. That to him was of the utmost importance. And I think the mission continues today. But I like the way you frame it, that it is important to understand that the Holocaust was the culmination of anti-Semitism that had been happening for so long and is continuing unto this day. And the same questions that guide us in the Holocaust are the ones we struggle to answer today. Why do they hate us so much?
Yeah. And the manifestations of that today. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about in the last, little while, our commitment as an organization, my personal commitment, our communal commitment to this idea of the promise of never again, right? That commitment to that. And I know your father spoke frequently about this and believed passionately, obviously, in this, and not just in its sort of most particular iteration as it relates to the Jewish community, right, and the safety and security of Jews, but really more universally for humanity. And I'm wondering what your perspective is on how we balance that in this moment, the universal and the particular interpretation of never again.
Listen, there was so much anguish on the quote that I think is in the Holocaust Museum, where my father talks about this issue very, very specifically. He says, not all victims were Jews, but all Jews were victims. Mm-hmm. The Holocaust was an attempt to exterminate the Jewish people.
And in this moment, some of what we're hearing, and I'm sure, unfortunately, that even some of your father's words have been sort of twisted in this way. We're hearing from, from people using this sort of call for never again as something sort of a weapon against the Jewish community in this moment, or a weapon against Israel, right? How do you explain that? What do you make of that? When you hear this kind of critique, I think it's generous to call it critique, but this kind of rhetoric come out and really painting, Jews as their oppressors in this moment. What do you say to that?
I mean, blood libel is a thing.
Yeah.
It's been around for a long time. We're Christ killers. In the Middle Ages, we were poisoning wells. We were murdering Christian babies. Is there anything we haven't been accused of?
And to your point, the lack of context around the fact that this isn't new, right? That these accusations and these stereotypes aren't new. These ideas aren't new, I think is something that we're trying to grapple with and educate about right now, and it's particularly important.
There is one difference, which is now you have to wrestle with the thought that there's Jewish power.
Yeah, right.
It's the first time in 2,000 years that there's been such a concept as Jewish power, that we have an obligation to make our own decisions, practical decisions, moral decisions about Israel's right to defend its citizenry, and how far do its obligations go in protecting enemy combatants and enemy civilians. I can't imagine who other than Charles Lindbergh in the 1940s was saying that we had an obligation to send the Red Cross into Berlin when the Battle of the Bulge was still occurring. I can't imagine other than Charles Lindbergh who was saying, we have to open the path so that food and water and power can be sent into Berlin. Some of it is just ludicrous when you think about what it means to have an enemy determined to kill you and how you have to respond to that.
Yeah. And it just feels like, the rock between the rock and the hard place that Israel is in right now. And having to navigate that over the long term, sort of the fight for security for its people and maintaining this spirit of civility and humanity is just, it feels like such a tension.
I think Israel will preserve its humanity no matter what. But I think there's a famous Golda Meir quote where she says, if we're forced to choose between, being alive and the world having a negative image of us, or being dead and the world thinking quite highly, I know which one we're going to choose.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. There's a few other things I'm sort of dying to ask you about. I want to touch on the role of faith and sort of values, religious values during these challenging times. I know that as you've shared, this was a sort of a foundational part of who your father was, his faith and his commitment to his identity as a religious man. And you've said that every time someone asked your father what he aspired to be, he would say a good Jew. Mm-hmm. So what is a good Jew in this moment?
A good Jew, and there's so many different ways to unpack that and double click on it. But the message that I received most directly from my father, both in personal conversations and also in his writings, a good Jew is one who involves themselves in Jewish communal affairs, who is part of Judaism, who doesn't say, those are a bunch of other people, I'm not part of it. Mm-hmm. And whether they pray or how they pray, or whether they wear a yarmulke or a black hat or none at all, whether they are left or right in their political views, to my father, none of that mattered. But someone who accepted that they were part of the Jewish community, that is what it meant to be a good Jew.
And embraced that.
And embraced it.
Yeah. So thinking about sort of the future, and when I think about the future, I think about my kids, and I know you're a father yourself, and you have two kids.
I have two kids, 18 and 15.
18 and 15. Okay, so you're almost, you've reached the 18-year-old threshold, and now you're looking at 3 years till empty nest, which is a whole different chapter. I'm so glad to hear you talk about the joy that you try and surround them with as it relates to Jewishness and Jewish identity, and I'm trying to do the same thing. It's hard. I find it challenging and sort of exhausting as a parent to sort of reckon with my own fear about the world that they're going to inherit. How do you navigate this as a parent? And did your, are there pieces that your father sort of showed you or taught you that you think are particularly helpful in your role as a parent in times like these, as a Jewish parent?
I think this is not a new piece of wisdom here. Kids watch what their parents do much more than what the parents say.
Isn't that true? Yeah.
And for me, my father was a role model in that he treated people with derech eretz. Derech eretz meaning proper way. He treated people correctly, with respect, with warmth. I often think that there are, in the same way that in Judaism we have a written Torah that Moses received at Sinai, and we have the oral tradition that was passed along by the sages until it was codified, in the first century. My father's written Torah is out there for everyone to see. They can read his works on almost any topic imaginable. His oral Torah, his oral tradition of who he was in person, what it was like to breathe the same air as him, to have him tell you he really does want to hear your story, to take your question and ask a question back, whether you're his hairdresser or a PhD or a rocket scientist or the president of the United States. My father treated people the same and was genuinely always curious, always interested in learning about people. And it was in everything he did. That's the role model that he was for me. In terms of Jewishness, I try to be a role model for my kids. When I read the Daf Yomi, I try when I can to actually have the book open in front of me at the dining room table. So this is something that my kids see, and it becomes a buildup of images. Every single morning before they go to school, I put out $1 for them to put into the tzedakah box so that one day when they're in shul and somebody comes around with a tzedakah box, they don't even have to think. The reaction is you dig into your pocket, you put $1 in. It's instinctive. It's just in there. I put on tefillin every day in the dining room where everybody's having breakfast so that they can see me and know that this is what Jewish life looks like. And, my son stopped putting tefillin on with me a few years after his bar mitzvah. He's like, yeah, this is no longer so interesting to me. I'm not so sure I, want to go this particular direction.
You're thinking, yeah, I've been there. You'll get over it.
He has his own dialogue with God,
Yeah, of course.
But when the attacks of October 7th happened, something happened that made me almost fall out of my chair. He went to school the next day, and he goes to a non-Jewish secular school. He walked out the door wearing a yarmulke.
Wow. Well, you're doing something right, I think, as a parent and thinking about sort of channeling that role model that your dad was for you. So I think you may know this. Your dad made several trips to Cincinnati. And the most recent of those was in 2012 when he spoke to 7,000 people, community members, students, faculty at Xavier University. And I pulled a quote from...
Was he getting an honorary degree?
I believe
Possibly.
There was
Okay.
part of that. Yes,
Okay.
that was part of it. But in sort of the course of his speech, he shared a quote about hope. And I'd just like to read it and sort of ask you to reflect on it in this moment as we think forward about the hope that we try to maintain right now. He said, "Hope is a gift, not a gift that God does not give every one of you. It's a gift that only you can give to another. Let us be worthy of that gift." Let us be worthy of that gift. How in this moment can we be worthy of the gift of hope for each other?
I think it's I was going to say very hard. I'm going to say impossible to anticipate when moments are going to arise where we can have a profound impact on someone. There's a story in Legends of Our Time, which my father wrote, I believe, in the 60s. It's the 8th story, and it's called A Jew from Saragossa. And I love that story. The story starts with a story. It starts with a story of the Besht, the Baal Shem Tov, and he's racing across the countryside with his wagon to get to this particular spot. And he gets there after all this work. He turns around, he gets there, and they stop. He says, okay, good, now we can go back. And his coachman is mystified. What do you mean? What happened? And the underpinning of the story is that you never know the significance of some moment to which you have been called. It might not be obvious. And then my father proceeds to tell the tale of how he encounters a man in this church who is giving tours in Saragossa. And the man and he start talking. What languages do you know? My father mentions he knows Hebrew. Hebrew, does it still exist? It still exists. Are you a Jew? I'm a Jew. They still exist. The man is almost shocked to discover that Jews are still a thing. And he says, you have to come back to my apartment. Do you know the story? I'm sorry if
I don't.
He says, you have to come back to my apartment. My father is taken aback. But he says, okay. And the man pulls from another room. He goes into the apartment. There's a crucifix, the Virgin Mary. And he pulls a piece of parchment. He's like, tell me what this parchment is, because it's right to left. Maybe it's Hebrew. I know Arabic is right to left. Maybe it's Hebrew. And my father is just overcome with emotion as he reads it. It's a document from a Murano 500 years ago, charging his children that one day they should know that Moshe ben Avraham wrote this document, and when it is safe for the Jews to hold their head high again in the world, they should know that they are descended from the Jewish people.
Wow.
My father tries to buy it off the man, and the man gets upset. He won't do it. My father says, no, really, this has meaning for my people. May I buy it from you? And the man says, absolutely not. You don't understand. First of all, he's like, you have to tell me what it says. And my father is refusing almost to translate. He just wants to acquire this thing. And the man says, you don't understand. This parchment was given to me by my father and to him by his father. And we were told that a curse would befall our family if we didn't keep passing it on. And it ends up being that the man is the child. He's the descendant of this line of people. And he doesn't believe it at first. My father reads to him the document. And years later, my father encounters the man again by accident in Israel. And he's learned to read Hebrew. He's become an Israeli citizen. And he says, my name is Moshe ben Avraham, the name from the document. He's chosen that name.
Wow.
You never know when you're going to come along at just the right moment to change someone's life.
Wow. Well, I think on that note, thank you for taking the time and, engaging in what has been really an incredibly fascinating and humbling conversation for me personally, and I'm sure for folks who are listening, and just such an illuminating perspective in the times that we're living in today.
My only regret is I didn't get to ask you a number of questions. But,
we'll have time for that later.
But thank you so much for the incredible warmth and hospitality that you've shown, and I'm really looking forward to meeting other members of the Jewish community here.
Wonderful. Thank you. To make sure you don't miss an episode, subscribe to our channel on YouTube and let us know your thoughts on this episode in the comments, or you can email us. You can also connect with us on Instagram and TikTok at Holocaust and Humanity, and X and Facebook at CincyHHC. Links are in the show notes. Thanks for joining us. Hear My Story is a production of the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust and Humanity Center. This series is part of the Cynthia and Harold Gutman Family Center for Storytelling. Our gratitude to Margaret and Michael Valentine, whose transformative support makes this series possible. Visit us in person in historic Union Terminal in Cincinnati, Ohio, or online anytime at holocaustandhumanity.org. Executive producers are David Wise and Jackie Congedo. Managing producer is Ann Thompson. Consulting producer is Joyce Kamen. Videography and editing are by Michael Holder. Emotions, opening theme music, is generously provided by Kik Lee. Videography and additional editing by Robert Mills. Recorded at the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust and Humanity Center in Cincinnati, Ohio.